Here we are, halfway through the course. So we are leaving the atomic molecular world of biomolecules and DNA and biochemistry, and we are now moving to the anatomy part of the course. So we've got our anatomical drawing behind us, and here we go. So our first topic is the digestive system. And today, in this video, we're going to be talking about the upper digestive system. So what happens when we first start to eat something? I have a chocolate here. Digestion happens immediately inside your mouth, believe it or not. In fact, it almost happens before you start to eat something, because as you look at food, you'll notice that your mouth will often start to salivate. You will salivate if you're hungry and you see food. That saliva is part of digestion. So there are two things that are going on inside your mouth. So your mouth is the first part of digestion, right up here. And two kinds of digestion happen in your mouth. Number one is physical digestion, physical, macroscopic. And that is chewing. You chew your food. And what physical digestion helps to do is to break food into little tiny pieces. And what that does is it increases the surface area of the food. By breaking it up into little pieces, you expose more of the food to the liquid that is in your mouth. And the liquid in your mouth is called saliva, and it is basically composed of water and of an enzyme. We're not done with molecular biology, sorry. Of an enzyme called salivary amylase, and both of these are secreted by special cells, special glands, called salivary glands. Salivary glands, you can see them here. Here, can I zoom into them? Oh, I can't zoom in, but here, I can move the thing. Salivary glands, these specialized cells here we go. These are salivary glands, these are salivary glands, these are salivary glands. So you secrete this fluid from these glands, and the water does two things. So you've got water, you've got an enzyme called salivary amylase. And what salivary amylase does is it is there to solely digest starch. We're not done with biomolecules yet, see? Starch, if you remember, are long chains of carbohydrates produced by plants. So you are already starting to digest sugars. Your body wants sugar. What is digestion for? That's the first question that we should ask. Well, digestion is a way of getting biomolecules into your blood. That's what digestion is for. It is for taking food, breaking it down, and getting biomolecules, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids into your blood, as well as some minerals and vitamins that you need to survive into your blood. That's what it's for. So getting that into your body. Food does not actually enter your body until it is in your blood. So make note when that happens, because there's always a question of when does food actually enter your body. It has not really entered our body here. If you notice, the digestive tract is a tube that runs down through your entire body, is exposed to the air. It's basically one long tube that runs down all through your body and opens on the other end and exits out. At no point while food is inside that tube is it actually inside your body. It is only when it enters the blood it is in your body. Yes, technically it is in the space that your body occupies, but it is exposed to the outside air. Therefore, it is not in your body. So, in the mouth, what's happening was we're digesting starch, the storage mechanism for sugar by plants, those big long polymers of glucose. And so salivary amylase comes along and it's breaking those covalent bonds that hold the glucose molecule together, and it's breaking starch down into smaller polypeptide chains. And the water is there because this is hydrolysis. Remember way back when in the biomolecules unit we talked about, or in the enzymes unit we talked about catabolic reactions, and hydrolysis is a catabolic reaction. It releases a little bit of heat, it releases energy, and catabolic means it's breaking stuff down. And there was dehydration synthesis, which is building things together, and hydrolysis, which is breaking things apart. And hydrolysis requires water, because remember, when we break those covalent bonds, we've got sort of loose dangly ends that need to be filled, and hydrogen and a hydroxide are used to plug the exposed ends, basically, of that former covalent bond. So that's happening in your mouth. And the other thing that water does in your mouth is it lubricates the food. It takes it, moistens it, so you're mechanical chewing, you're mechanical digesting, so you're breaking it down, making a greater surface area, so then chemical digestion, which is the salivary amylase, can start to take place and be more efficient. And while you're chewing, you're mixing water and that amylase all throughout the food, so that it can start, that those starches can start being digested. So that's the first thing you digest, is starch. Nothing else. You're just digesting starch. You're physically digesting the food, and you're chemically digesting starch. And then you swallow. And what controls swallowing? Swallowing is involuntary. I mean, I can think to swallow, but it's controlled by your autonomic nervous system. The pharynx, which is the back of your throat, is called the pharynx. Do we have a good view here of the pharynx in this image? Sometimes we don't. Is there a better one somewhere? The pharynx is basically, it's like the train station of the inside of the throat. It's the back of the mouth. And what happens at the pharynx is your nasal passages, your oral passages, the esophagus, which is the tube that food goes down to, and your trachea all meet in this one area called the pharynx. And so when you swallow, muscles around the pharynx squeeze. So your food goes down your tongue to the back of your throat into that region, into the pharynx. Those muscles contract and the food gets squeezed down into our next structure. So we had the pharynx first, so we've got the mouth, then we have the pharynx, and then we have the esophagus. That's the next thing. Now, the esophagus, when you swallow, there's another thing that's happening, which we will talk about more in the respiratory system, is you also have the trachea. In front of the esophagus is the trachea, and the trachea is the tube that leads to your lungs. You don't want food going down to your lungs. Nothing that can be done with them in the lungs. So what happens is, as you swallow, there is a flap of skin covering the trachea. Sorry, not of skin, of muscle. There's a little flap of muscle covering the trachea called the epiglottis. The opening to the trachea is called the glottis. The epiglottis is a little piece of muscle, so when you swallow, it slams shut and doesn't let food go down into the trachea. Sometimes in kids, this is underdeveloped, so kids are actually likely to choke. Kids are really good at choking. When I was a kid, I actually choked on a hot dog. It got stuck. And I still remember it vividly. One of my earliest lifehood memories is of me choking on a hot dog, not being able to breathe. It was a horrible feeling, and trying to signal my mom. And my mom was like, "Are you being silly? What are you doing?" Luckily, I coughed the hot dog bit out before I lost consciousness, so I live to teach you today. So, mechanical digestion in the mouth, chemical digestion of starches, back to the pharynx. The involuntary contraction of the pharynx causes you to swallow. Epiglottis closes so food does not go down into the trachea. Food enters the esophagus. Now, the esophagus, we call it a tube, but if you were to look down the tube, it's not an open tube. You would not be able to see me looking through the tube. It's actually a closed, mushy tube. It's not really held open. And it has two layers of muscle lining this tube. It's got longitudinal muscle, so muscle that goes up and down the tube, and circular muscle that does this. It basically squeezes the tube. It can open and squeeze the tube. And what happens is food enters into there, gets jammed into there by the swallowing. It's squished in there. The food, by the way, at this point is called a bolus. It's called a bolus. So when you chew food, you chew it up, you've turned it into a food bolus. And the food bolus enters your esophagus. And then the esophagus, what it does is the food doesn't fall down. Gravity doesn't play a part in this. It doesn't. Food doesn't fall down into your stomach. You can eat while standing on your head, and you will still have food go to your stomach. You can go to outer space, and you will not starve because swallowing does not depend on gravity. What happens is a process called peristalsis. So those circular muscles and those longitudinal muscles coordinate together to squeeze and shorten the esophagus and squeeze and push the food down towards your stomach. That's what's happening in the esophagus. So that food bolus, which is a mixture of water now, chewed up food, and salivary amylase, are heading down to your stomach. And the first thing they encounter as they get to the end of the esophagus is a sphincter. Now, what's a sphincter? A sphincter is a door of circular muscle that can open and close. And so it controls how much food enters the stomach. And that is our next waypoint on the journey of food through your digestive system. So we started in the mouth. Physical digestion, chemical digestion of starches, the pharynx. We swallowed, go down the esophagus using longitudinal and circular muscles to peristalsis food down. The food bolus heads down to the sphincter. The name of the sphincter at the top there is called the cardiac sphincter, and the cardiac sphincter lets food into the stomach. Now, so food gets to the cardiac sphincter opens, and now some food bolus enters into the stomach, and the environment in the stomach is very different from the environment in the other parts of the digestive system. It is acidic. Sure you have heard of stomach acid. It is acidic in the stomach. The pH of the stomach, it's around 2 something. Do I have it noted here? It's 2 something, 2 something, which is very low pH. And that's thanks to something called hydrochloric acid. Now, your stomach, a bunch of things happen in your stomach. Your stomach's responsible for a whole bunch of stuff. Now, your stomach, similar to the esophagus, has 2 layers of muscle. It's got longitudinal muscle to shrink it and squeeze it like an accordion. And it has circular muscle to squeeze the stomach this way. Has an additional layer of muscle compared to the esophagus. It has oblique muscle. So that's muscle kind of going on an angle. And what this muscle does is in waves, it can do this to the stomach. It can so the stomach can squeeze this way, it can shorten, and it can do this. This is for the oblique muscle and the other muscles also. The other muscles are also for pushing the food along in the stomach, but also they are for physical digestion. So they're further breaking down the food and further mixing the food with the contents of the stomach. Now, what are the contents of the stomach? The contents of the stomach are called gastric juice, stomach juice, gastric juice. How does the gastric juice get there? Well, first we have to talk about glands. Glands. There are 2 types of glands in your body. There are exocrine glands and endocrine glands. In my opinion, they are incorrectly named. So the difference between the 2 types of glands is whether they have a duct or don't have a duct. Now, you would assume that endocrine glands have a duct, but you would be wrong. Endocrine glands do not have the duct. They are ductless. I guess it helps when you write endocrine glands, it's END. The ND stand for no duct. Endocrines have no duct. Exocrine glands do have a duct, and a duct is just a tube, basically, that leads to where you want the products of the endocrine gland to go. So, of the exocrine gland to go. So, for example, those salivary glands are exocrine glands. They have little ducts that when the salivary glands produce saliva, that saliva flows down those ducts into the mouth. Those are exocrine glands. I want to call them endocrine glands so bad, but they are not endocrine glands. They are exocrine glands. So, the products of exocrine glands are proteins and hormones, some other stuff too. So, for example, our salivary glands produce that enzyme called amylase, salivary amylase. And that's an enzyme, that's a protein, as well as water. There's also water that flows out. So, now, endocrine glands are glands that release their products directly into the blood, into capillaries of the blood. Capillaries are very tiny blood vessels. That's what capillaries are. So, endocrine glands have no duct. They just stuff goes right into the blood, and then it flows through the blood and until it encounters its target tissue and does what it does. Exocrine glands excrete proteins, enzymes. Endocrine glands excrete hormones. Remember hormones? And these could be lipid-based hormones or protein-based hormones. So those are the two types of glands. So back to the stomach. The stomach has both types of glands in it. So what happens is the cardiac sphincter opens, food enters the stomach. Another anatomical feature of the stomach, if you look at the inside of the stomach, do I have a stomach? I think the stomach's been stolen from our little model guy. But the inside of the stomach has, I just really like saying this word, that's why I'm bringing it up. The inside of the stomach has these folds in it. They increase surface area, but they also help to crush, to churn the food because they're these strong folds. And the folds have the best name. I love this name. It's Rugae. Rugae. They're called Rugae. The inside of the stomach has Rugae. 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 I don't know. I like that word. So, food enters the stomach and it stretches the stomach. And in the walls of the stomach are, remember, 3 layers of muscle, rugae, and stretch receptors. Part of the nervous system, autonomic nervous system. And these stretch receptors, they stretch, and that tells the stomach, hey, there's food inside the stomach. And then those stretch receptors are connected to endocrine glands, which, remember, their products go right into the blood system, called G cells. And these G cells excrete a hormone called, secrete a hormone called gastrin. And this hormone, gastrin, then enters the blood, circulates through the blood, and its target tissue is the stomach. So it basically enters the blood and then goes right back to the stomach. And it tells the cells lining the stomach, and these are exocrine glands, to excrete gastric juice. And gastric juice contains, let me make sure we get the right stuff, gastric juice contains water, contains hydrochloric acid to lower the pH of the stomach, and contains a protein called pepsinogen. Okay, those 3 things. Hydrochloric acid, water, and pepsinogen. And those are exocrine glands secrete that. So let's just talk about that again. Cardiac sphincter opens, food enters the stomach. The food bolus stretches the walls of the stomach, which triggers stretch receptors to activate endocrine glands called G cells that then those endocrine glands secrete gastrin, a hormone, into the blood, which then goes through the blood, goes back to the lining of the stomach, and it activates the lining of the stomach to then excrete from exocrine glands gastric juice, which contains water, hydrochloric acid, and pepsinogen. Now, let's focus in on pepsinogen. So pepsinogen is what's called a precursor. If we were to draw, let's say we draw pepsinogen, it's an enzyme that looks like this, let's say. And here is the active site of the enzyme, and here's this thing covering the active site. Now, I don't know if that's what, that's what it looks like, but this is just the model. So this is Pepsinogen, okay? And so this goes down the duct from those exocrine glands lining the inside of the stomach, and it enters into the stomach. Pepsinogen enters the stomach. Now, the inside of the stomach is, the pH is a lot lower. The pH is like 2. So it means we've got all those, remember we got all those hydrogen ions floating around. Those hydrogen ions, they pull apart, change, denature pepsinogen. But how they denature it is they remove the thing blocking the active site of pepsin. Dun dun! And now you have pepsin. So pepsin is an active enzyme, and what this enzyme does is it breaks peptide bonds. Remember peptide bonds from our biomolecules unit? Where are peptide bonds? They are between amino acids in proteins. So what pepsin does is it now starts digesting the proteins in your food, breaking down those peptide chains into shorter peptide chains. Certain peptide bonds are being broken down. Because remember, the goal of digestion is to break polymers down into monomers that then can be absorbed and used by your body. Oh, this video is getting really long. I'm really sorry. We're still not done yet. So, why do we need to go through this? Why can't we just have pepsin be secreted by those cells lining the stomach immediately? Well, because this digests proteins. What the heck are you made out of? You're made out of proteins. So if pepsin got loose somehow, it would eat the cell that it makes it. You can't have that. It would start eating your own body. Can't have that. So as a result, we make pepsinogen, and only once it's in the stomach, in the acid of the stomach is lined with mucus. Those cells also secrete this mucus. So the mucus kind of contains all the acid, all the bad stuff in it. It doesn't let it burn the sides of your stomach. If you get stressed out, if you're stressed out all the time, what happens is you actually, being under stress all the time, shuts down your digestive system, and you stop producing that mucus. And then the acid and these guys start to eat the lining of your stomach. We produce pepsinogen. When it enters the stomach, it gets denatured into pepsin. Pepsinogen is the precursor, and we need it so we don't digest our own body. What else? The stomach, not only. And so what's being digested in the stomach now is proteins. Nothing else, just proteins. We digested some carbohydrates in the mouth. We've physically broken down the food, but we haven't done a lot of chemical digestion. Now we're digesting proteins in the stomach. That's all that's digested in the stomach. And the low pH in the stomach denatures salivary amylase, so it becomes inactive. It stops working. Salivary amylase only works inside the mouth. The pH of the mouth is like 7. It's pretty neutral, the pH of the mouth. So that's the optimum pH. Remember the enzymes unit, that's the optimum pH of salivary amylase. What else happens in the stomach? The stomach, other things happen in the stomach. So as salivary amylase gets denatured, food is physically broken down by the churning, by the rugae. Bacteria. The stomach is actually part of your immune system, part of the passive part of your the innate immunity. Because of all this hydrochloric acid in there, because of the low pH, you breathe stuff in, you breathe in pathogens. You have all these cilia inside your trachea. So if these pathogens get into your trachea, the mucus in your trachea gets pushed up into your pharynx. Remember, that's where all the tubes meet. And it gets swallowed then by your esophagus, all that mucus, all those pathogens that are trying to make it down into your lungs. and it enters into your stomach, and your stomach denatures and kills all of those bacteria and viruses and whatever else, fungus and whatever else that you're breathing in. So that's one of the roles of the stomach, is to kill bacteria in your stomach. So denature salivary amylase, denature pepsinogen into pepsin, and the low pH also helps break the food down. Those hydrogen ions are also pulling on the food and breaking the food down and helping to denature those peptide chains, so it's easier for pepsin to digest that. So that's what's happening in your stomach. The other role of your stomach is also to store food. You actually store food in your stomach for a little while. There is a sphincter at the bottom of the stomach. Where's that sphincter? There's the sphincter. It's called the Pyloric Sphincter, and it is closed until, so your food spends some time inside your stomach and is being digested over time and stored before it enters the next area, which is part of the lower digestive tract, which will be in the next video. So I think we've covered everything here. We've covered exocrine, endocrine glands. Know the difference between those. Last thing. Gastric juice, so the stuff that's secreted into, contains hydrochloric acid, contains pepsinogen, and contains water. The water has two roles again. The water is there to lubricate the food, to help dissolve the food and dissolve the acid, but it's also there for hydrolysis, which is what pepsin is doing. All these enzymes of digestion are doing hydrolysis, catabolic reactions, hydrolysis, breaking bonds, and you need water for hydrolysis to work. Water is one of the substrates of hydrolysis. That's why you need to drink water. If you don't drink water, you can't digest your food. Remember, you die if you don't drink 3 days on average. You do for the last 3 days. Okay. I leave on that, but let's just a review. So, overall review: mechanical and chemical digestion of starches inside your mouth, into the pharynx. The muscles of the pharynx involuntarily contract. Food enters the esophagus. Peristalsis, longitudinal and circular muscles push the food down to the cardiac sphincter. The sphincter opens. Food enters. The food bolus enters the stomach, where it is mechanically digested by oblique muscles and rugae, which are folds on the lining of the stomach. The stretching of the stomach triggers stretch receptors, which activate G cells, which are endocrine glands that secrete a hormone called gastrin that goes through your circulatory system, goes right back to the stomach, which activates exocrine glands that excrete down ducts. Gastric juice, which contains water, pepsinogen, and hydrochloric acid. The pepsinogen, when it enters the low pH of the stomach, is then denatured into pepsin. And along with the water, pepsin breaks down the peptide bonds in your food, the protein bonds in your food. Bacteria are killed in here. Food is stored in here. And there's one thing, the pepsin breaks down the bonds, and I think that is all there is to say. Is there anything to say? Oh, the food bolus, its name has now changed as it's reached the pyloric sphincter. It is no longer a food bolus. It is now acid chyme. It has been turned into chyme, acid chyme. And we will pick up with acid chyme in the next video.